Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark. And this week, we ended up switching things up a little bit because we are taping the show on Thursday, the day after Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist, was murdered at a public appearance in Utah. And it just didn't feel right to do just a regular show. But I have a couple of other things for this show that I think will be worthwhile as we all kind of, think through and grapple with the news of Charlie Kirk's assassination, even though at the time of taping, we do not know who it was that killed him. So first, I'm going to bring you a brief chat with a friend of mine who is an expert in political violence, Rachel Kleinfeld. She is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and nobody knows more than her about political violence, both in America and abroad. Then we're going to listen to some sound from across the political spectrum over the years, really mainly since the last 2 or 3 years, that we've heard in focus groups, because one of the things that we have found is how scared people are. I hear expressions of fear all the time in the focus groups. It comes up more and more. And it is especially prominent when there has just been a big violent event of some kind. And unfortunately, there have been a great many of those over the years I have been doing focus groups. And I won't go through all of them right now, but there has been a lot of political violence, whether it was January 6th or the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. There has been just general violence, mass shootings, school shootings. There was a school shooting the same day that Charlie Kirk was shot yesterday. It's just becoming this like background noise that we're all living with, but it is doing real damage, I think, to people and their psyches and how they feel like they can live and exist in the world. And so we're gonna contemplate all of that today. And so without further ado, let's bring in Rachel Kleinfeld. Rachel Kleinfeld, thanks for being here. Can you just tell me out of the gate? So obviously, I think Americans, not super online Americans, but like regular people exist, like they take these things in and it just sort of, it's like 1,000 cuts of fear that add up over time. But you're an expert in political violence. So maybe you could just talk for a little bit about, in days like this, after there's been a big act of political violence, like what is the impact that it has over time on sort of the body politic?
So this one is different than a lot of the past ones. And I'm not going to be your happiest guest here because this is bad news. Basically, we've had a string of threats since 2015. We've had this rising number of political violence threats. And then we started to see actual rising violence. A lot of it was coming from the right. We started to see threats from the left, Brett Kavanaugh and so on. And then we've seen some that are mixed, like the Trump assassination attempt that was from, like most political violence, a kind of deranged individual, not clearly left or right. That's very common for the first attempted assassination. We don't know who committed this, but what we are seeing now is more growth from people on the other side, the United Healthcare CEO and so on. And when you start seeing two sides go at it, it's different than when you just see it growing from one. And that trend line leads to kind of tit for tat violence, but it also leads to just other kinds of violence. So there was a school shooting yesterday. No one is even talking about it. But when violence gets more normalized in the public square, you see more mass shooting, school shooting, this kind of thing. So this one was different for all those reasons. I think you're going to see a much greater growth of violence from all sides. And there's no winners here.
Hey, Dave, one of the things that is striking to me today, and where it's all still pretty fresh, so we're all sort of processing it, but right now we're living in a world of the hot takes and the reactions. But I guess one of the things I found the most shocking about the way that Donald Trump, President Trump, and other Republicans are reacting to this is we still, at the moment of this taping, have not apprehended the person who did it. So we don't know what his motivations are. It does appear to be based on a photo that's circulating that it's a boy or a young man. But I got to tell you, we've gotten tons of misinformation that have been coming out. The FBI director is tweeting that they have someone in custody, and then that turns out not to be the case. And so, there's just today, there's been, there's transgender and anti-fascist writing on the bullet casings, which is now being walked back by authorities. And so, it's very difficult to figure out even what is happening. But a lot of Donald Trump last night addressed the nation from the Oval Office and blamed it on Democrats and their toxic rhetoric, and talked about, in his own way, putting a stop to it, not in a way that was sort of in a uniting kind of way, but in a we're going to hunt these people down kind of way. And it not even being clear at all who these people are. We've had Nancy Mace, lots of Republican legislators today going out and saying the left did this. This is because of the left's rhetoric. That is so different from the way elected officials in the United States have approached political violence in the past, whether it's Gabby Giffords or a school shooting. Like, typically these things tend to unite people, or at least our elected officials understand they need to appeal to people's better angels. It's a time to tamp things down. But these elected officials are ramping things up, including the president of the United States. What does that say about where we are?
There's a lot of tragedies when a 31-year-old father of two is murdered. But one of the big tragedies is seeing how it's being handled by politicians like Trump. Because one thing we know about political violence is that you can ramp it up and you can ramp it down. And you ramp it up when you aggrandize the person who committed it. When, like Rittenhouse, telling someone that they're playing to an audience who likes them is a great way to get more violence, because a lot of these folks who commit the violence are a little deranged, a little aggressive, but a lot of what they're looking for is to be famous. They want to be Luke Skywalker. They want to be important. And so when you give them that, you get more. And we also know that when political leaders say this is not acceptable, it's not okay. I don't know if you remember, after 9/11, there was a whole move from the military to call Al-Qaeda losers. When you tell people that this is a loser act, it goes down. It has to be from your own side that you're saying that. And so what we really need is politicians on both sides to say, absolutely not on my watch, not in my city, not in my house. This is not something I allow in my party. And you see that a little. Barack Obama came out and said that. There are other, leaders who have come out and said that kind of thing that's been helpful, but sure not from everybody. The other thing you need to hear is you need to hear people from that ideological side in general saying, this isn't cool, we don't accept this. When you hear a lot of people lauding it, again, somebody wants to be Luke Skywalker, and so the social media is not helpful either.
Well, let's talk about the social media, because that's the part that I think kind of gets me just really sick to my stomach, is what I'm sort of watching unfold. And I felt this way after the United Healthcare CEO was shot. And there's like two things happening online right now. So there's the right-wing influencers and politicians and the president of the United States that are automatically placing blame on the left in a very, like, you did this. You did this. Democrats did this. We need to crack down on Democrats. Like, you're seeing calls to censor Democrats or, deport people who have criticized Charlie Kirk but who are here from other countries. Just really wild stuff from people who, claim to be pro free speech, but they're basically saying we're going to use this. We're not going to spare a this emergency isn't going to go unutilized by us to increase this sort of authoritarian crackdown and to diminish our political opponents and cast them as evil. On the flip side, I'm seeing a lot of sort of, good riddance to bad rubbish Charlie Kirk takes, not from Democratic politicians. And this is actually an important distinction, I think, not from a lot of sort of the leading voices in either the Democratic Party or sort of Democratic world, certainly the mainstream media or people who are on sort of the cable networks are, for the most part, acting with, I think, real forbearance. Like kindness, thought, like everybody is recognizing this was a human being who had a family, was a young man. But there is like a fair amount of just like takes on social media that are like, let me show you all of the horrible things that he said. Here's why he was a terrible person. And I guess I find both of those difficult because you know what? I did not agree with anything Charlie Kirk said. And I have lots of strong feelings about many of the things that he said. Yeah. But I can kind of wait on some of that, I think, in a moment when like his children have just lost their father. And I guess you'd love to see some of that. But social media turns us into this machine where everybody feels the need to like say the thing right away. And so like sort of on the right, there's this,
Let me stop you because it's easy to blame social media. Okay. We are doing this. People are writing this stuff. It's not just the algorithm. Some of it might be bots writing it for other bots, but we are losing our humanity on the right, as you say, this pointing of a finger, this is Democrats. It's not Democrats. Everything we know about political violence is that it's a far left who actually also dislike Democrats that are supportive of political violence. On the left, it's a very clear trend of this kind of extra far left that likes political violence. You saw them in the 60s and 70s too. This pointing a finger, extraordinarily unhelpful. And as you're saying, this support for the murder, extremely dehumanizing. And one thing we know about political violence is that it's much easier to commit when you dehumanize the other side. When you treat the other side like a symbol, like a cockroach, like an animal, you see this go up. And we're seeing that, and sure, some of it might be the anonymity of social media lets people kind of do that, and the algorithm definitely rewards extremism. But people are writing this stuff because in their social media, it's okay on the right to point a finger and say there's Democrats, and we're going to go to war with your city, and we're going to go after you. And on the left, it's getting to be okay to say we're allowed to kill a 31-year-old. And one of the reasons that this is happening, by the way, is that the government is not doing what the government is supposed to do. You see political violence rise like this when the government doesn't treat people equally in law enforcement. So when you release folks on January 6th who committed those heinous crimes, the other side says, well, there's not going to be equal justice. We have to take justice into our own hands. We see that in every country that has political violence. When the state doesn't seem to be equal, the opposition says, well, we got to take it into our own hands. Nonviolent kinds of forms of activity are being discredited. This is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. When you kill Martin Luther King Jr., you get Malcolm X. And so we're seeing the same kind of trend lines. And that extremism, we have to own it. We can't blame it all on the social media.
Okay, I take that point 100%. Like these are people behind these sentiments. And I think it says something about where we are as a country that people feel comfortable talking like this and that they don't sort of abide by the norms of civility and decency that would just dictate, hey, in the direct aftermath of something like this, can you wait to find out what happened and just express sympathy for the loss of life? Since you study violence in other countries extensively, where is America now is there like a life cycle of political violence, like ways that it ebbs and flows and or I don't know, where are we in this cycle?
So that's why I started off by saying I was a bad news guest. We're not in a good place in this cycle. So I've been watching the growth of political violence in America since 2015, the latest growth, because we have a lot of history of this, of course, the killing of civil rights workers and then the 60s and 70s and the militias. And so this is not our first rodeo, but it's been rising pretty quickly since 2015. And I'd been sort of holding my breath, can it stay mostly to one side? Not entirely, but when it's mostly on one side and it's not the government, it's not the state, you kind of have a lid on the pot. That's what it looked like when it was militias and skinheads in the 80s and early 90s, mostly on one side. There's a lid on the pot. When it spreads to the other side, which started with like the Tesla dealership fires, the United Health CEO, the threat against Brett Kavanaugh to some extent, although that one was a little different because it was an older man. Most political violence is young people. That has a kind of trend line of its own. It's got a momentum that's a little different. As it starts spreading to the other side, then you get tit for tat violence. So you can imagine things speed up. It accelerates. You get more of it. When the state doesn't kind of keep the lid on the pot, when the state stops treating people equally and says, we're going to let off some people who are violent, we're going to go after other people who are violent, then you discredit all of the voices that are saying, don't use violence, there's other ways to solve these problems. And what you tend to get are these violent fringes that get more credibility. And I think that is where we are now. And the majority of Americans still condemn political violence. Most people do. But political violence is mostly a young people's activity. Everywhere in the world, violence is mostly men under 25, 28-ish. And so when they start normalizing violence, what you get is kind of a back and forth between extremes. And I think we're about to see that.
I'm not exactly pushing back, but I guess that presupposes a little bit that the attack on Charlie Kirk is from the left. I mean, no, I hear you. Okay, no, it doesn't. I'm getting that wrong.
No, I mean, I don't know who did this, and I sure hope that it was not from the left. That would be better. But it doesn't matter because the first Trump assassination also was not from the left. It was just a guy who was going to also had Biden on his target list. And it's been made in the ideology of this far right that you're seeing online. It's part of a line, Brett Kavanaugh, Trump assassination, now Charlie Kirk. It doesn't matter that it wasn't from the left because that part has been erased in the common litany of grievances. And so, I hope this wasn't from the left for all sorts of good reasons, but I'm not sure it'll make that much of a difference.
Can you tell me why you say that? Is it because you say that not as I think I'm hearing you right, that you say that not as a person who is, oh, well, I'm from the left and I don't want it to be one of my people. You're saying it as it's better to contain it on one side. Like if it exists on one side, it's easier to contain than if you do actually have now a burgeoning problem on the left where you're getting into a Hatfields versus McCoy.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just about the momentum of violence, right? If one side keeps punching, that's bad. That's really bad. But it's much worse when one side punches, the other punches back. That causes an escalation. And when the government isn't saying, stop it and go to your corners, but is favoring one side, you can imagine the other side says, okay, well, then I'll get my big brother. The way violence works is if they don't trust a referee, you get people taking it into their own hands. And I think that's where the country is. And that trend line just tends to accelerate things quite a bit. And it also, by the way, I think I mentioned it accelerates non-political violence too. You just start seeing copycats of various sorts.
So last question, how do you get out of something like this? Like when people have gotten out of these cycles of violence, what do they do?
I mean, again, the prescription is real easy. It's the doing of it. Political leaders say no, communities say no, and geographic communities, and then communities of ideology say no. And as that starts happening, let me take a step back. Most violence is committed by people who are aggressive, have impulse disorders, maybe they're drinking, on drugs, they're having mental disturbances, mostly young men. That's who commits most violence of all sorts in the world. When they start targeting political figures, it's because they're hearing more about those political figures. Usually they target people in their own lives. But when they hear about the political figures, you're a little bit disturbed, you're aggressive. Okay, maybe I'll go after Nancy Pelosi's husband or Trump. When it gets normalized and people feel like you'll be appreciated for targeting people, then you get an increase, right? The people who might have targeted political figures plus the ones who used to target their family members or neighbors, now they're going to target. But normal people who don't usually commit violence can get into committing violence if they think they're defending something that they're allowed to use violence for. Most people don't commit violence, but you'll commit violence to save a kid. You'll commit violence in a revolution that is appreciated by your community, like the American Revolution. There are certain times when it's okay for normal people to commit violence in any society. Defensive violence is much easier to get regular people to commit. So when you get to that point, suddenly the lid's off. You get much more because you're not talking about these people who are aggressive and have impulse disorders. You're talking about normal people who are defending something, their tribe, their group, their kids. I think we're very soon going to see that. That's the big, that's the accelerator.
I mean, that's always the thing I think about January 6th, is that those people thought they were the good guys, right? They thought they were defending a stolen election.
You're right. You should amplify that. They think they're the good guys because that's the point. I should have made it more closely. But
it's all right. You got it. Thanks, buddy. All right. So I want to get to some of the sound. And one point I want to make up front is that large portions of the sound you're about to hear are pegged to various instances of political violence in the last few years, which I will point out as we go. So I want to start by listening to progressive and Democratic-leaning participants from the last few years. Now, the first two bits of sound were from people who attended the No Kings protest this past summer, which you'll remember took place in the backdrop of the assassination of Melissa Hortman, that state representative I mentioned at the top, in Minnesota. Let's listen.
Well, this was the first protest that I had gone to, and actually I really wasn't planning on going, but I had a friend with me, and so let's check it out. I was a little nervous because there's a lot of crazies out there, and it wouldn't take much for someone with a gun or a car just to drive through. You just don't know.
My concern would be that a nut job like the guy in Minneapolis or a Proud Boy would think nothing better than to go to a big city with 25,000 people and, drive a car through or take an incendiary device to be a Minuteman to quell our dissatisfaction. I think there just seems to be a violence simmering that we're all used to, like the frog in the boiling water.
Said, civil war seems sooner rather than later. It's getting very difficult to talk to people who do not agree with you without getting offensive or activating their defenses.
But I can't see it getting to that point. I mean, the way that we're trending with violence, look what happened with the riot in January. Like, before that, nobody would have ever imagined that, like on a government building. That was unimaginable. But now that it did happen, there's definitely people out there that are like, okay, we can make this happen. So it is scary to think about. Like, I don't hope for it and would never wish on it, but it's scary. And I think it is a possibility.
I mean, there's such extreme reactions now to the most simple things.
Yeah.
Like even like wearing mask on a plane, even though you're supposed to wear a mask on a plane, and it leads to all this violence. And so it's a scary position to be in.
So that's why you don't want to say anything because you're too scared of what they might do.
Like she said, they might have a gun. You can say the least little thing and people will just, it's a fuse. Snap for the least little thing. So you just don't know. You have to protect yourself too.
And I also feel like there's I don't know how to describe it, but there's like a bloodlust in the air. Like a lot of people want to air out a lot of their grievances and they feel like they might have permission to do so more so than they did in the past. So, it's got me thinking about, what's my future in the United States, to be honest.
Well, the whole revolution in Iran started with basically taking over the government, a coup. So like the whole January thing happened, I was extremely scared, and everybody was like, everything's going to be fine. Nobody took it too seriously. I was terrified. I was like, guys, I grew up in a country where this literally happened.
I think what I hear a lot of, and what was in some of these clips of sound, are people who feel like their voice they feel like chilled by the political violence, right? They're kind of afraid to go to a protest, or they're worried about what might happen. Things that I do agree. I mean, people can say it's privilege or what have you, but I think when it comes to political violence, 15 years ago, other than something like 9/11, I remember when Reagan, there was the assassination attempt on him. And obviously I watched all of the things that happened in the 60s. That was all before I was born. Not the Reagan stuff, but I was very, very little. But I feel like I grew up during a period of relative, it's not like we didn't have contentious issues. There was, I spent much of my 20s and early 30s doing the work around gay marriage and repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. People had strong feelings about this. There were protesters that showed up on all sides of these things. I remember going to lots of pride, parades, and there being angry protesters there with, nasty signs. But I don't know, people would talk to each other and even people would go and, they would just ignore the people with the signs, or they would wave to them. But there wasn't, I can't remember thinking during any of those times, man, I wonder if we're going to get shot for doing this. Because that just didn't feel like a thing that happened in America. And I hear a lot more of expressions of that just sort of base level of fear about putting yourself out there now. And I think obviously I have a point of view on how much Donald Trump's rhetoric of retribution, his celebration of people who have committed violence for his side. I mean, Rachel was just talking about this, but Kyle Rittenhouse, sort of regardless of how you feel about him and what your sort of moral judgment is on whether he was acting in self-defense or whether he put himself in that situation in a totally irresponsible way, there's no way you look at it and think, let's make this guy a hero. Let's make this guy a cause celeb. And I think that has become a pretty strange feature of our politics, where we do celebrate people who are who do horrible things. I remember some of the people who, I was always more of a Republican, and I remember PETA and sort of left-wing activism that I saw. I was always like, you don't celebrate these people. You don't, and sometimes people did, and I thought that was insane. And I think it's insane now to see people celebrating people who commit violence, even if it's in a way that, you could say is justified. Being justified is different from celebrating people. And so, I just really, I do think it hits this sense that people have this fear now, both that Donald Trump has whipped people up to such a degree that they could experience political violence just by going out and protesting, but also that people feel, this is something I hear a lot, that people feel like 10% or 15% crazier, that people feel like things are, they just feel like the world's gotten crazier. There's we'll get to more sound, but I hear a lot of people just feeling like, because this is in here too, right? The idea that the smallest thing could set people off, right? And I know that Rachel wanted to make sure that social media, that's not the culprit, and I get that. I do think there's something warped though that's happening to us where my algorithm, I see all kinds of insane behavior on airplanes now that maybe before we had phones this was happening. but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like people are on kind of a hair trigger. And so you see these things of people, getting in a fight and getting kicked off an airplane, and behaving like children, right? That there is a way in which everyone's just a little bit, their feelings are sitting too close to the surface, and we forget how to kind of navigate things like normal, responsible adults. And, in this case, this is somebody saying, the one of the clips was from somebody who talked about wearing a mask on a plane. And that was from 2022 when, Tucker Carlson was encouraging people, if they saw somebody who was masked or who was masking their kid, to go up to them and accuse them of child abuse, or, tell them that it was insane of them to still be masking. And this is another one where it's like, regardless of how you felt about masks and their relative utility or lack thereof, or the way in which that eventually they became polarized along political lines, just regardless of all that, like, why would you go up to someone and tell them whether or not they should have a mask on? Like, why would you get in someone's face about that? Why would you accuse them of child abuse about something that is clearly a decision that parents and their kids can make together? Like, this idea too, I think encouraging people to kind of get up in each other's grill is a strange thing that we're seeing more and more of. And obviously, there's also, somebody in here was referencing January 6th, which I think unsettled a lot of people, both that it could happen, that you could have people attack the Capitol, that they could violently beat up cops. And I think we went through a more normal phase in the immediate aftermath where it did shock the conscience, shock the system, the body politic. But that shock wore off. And it went from, yes, we all agree this was bad, to, well, I wouldn't have handled it that way, or it was a bad day, but I think people are just using it to make Trump look bad. It wasn't Trump's fault. They're being too hard on people, and people were prosecuted for their actions that day. Of course, Donald Trump pardoned them the second he was back in power. And I think that this idea that political violence, if you do it in service of Donald Trump or other Republicans, you can get away with it, I do think has people on the left on edge in a way that is understandable. When Donald Trump says he's going to be retribution and is trying to use the power of the state in all kinds of ways, and we have ICE in the streets with masks where you can't see their faces while they're sort of grabbing the Uber Eats guy off of a moped and throwing him to the ground, people are going to be on edge and fearful. And I think the more afraid people are, the more that leads to additional political violence or other kinds of violence, just because people kind of live very much on edge. And that's how a lot of the voters sound in the focus groups, just on edge, an awareness that we're being desensitized to the violence, fear that it can be weaponized against them, fear that people are a little crazy. This line, but it's like, it says, I also feel like I don't know how to describe it, but there's like a bloodlust in the air. And that was just in February of 2024. So anyway, this is just, and we basically went and grabbed the sound that was very easy to sort of understand and easy to contextualize, but it's woven through all kinds of statements that people make when they're talking about things. They sort of take for granted now the sense that violence in the political context is something that we live with. All right. So I want to move on to more conservative leaning voters and listen to how they talk about it, because the sort of fear of political violence, the sense that your side is being sort of more targeted than the other side, is a bipartisan feeling, a bipartisan sense. So and the idea that the atmosphere is too hot, that it's not good for us, I think is a bipartisan feeling among voters. So let's listen to how these Republicans talked about political violence.
We are too divided, and those that are running the debate in the public forum are not the majority. I think a couple other folks have expressed that opinion, but it's that silent majority that we heard about a generation or two back that aren't engaging and aren't being involved, and that loud, raucous minority is ruling the roost, primarily through intimidating the rest of us into keeping quiet.
I think things are getting more violent in general. I've seen such a change since, I think it's been ever since COVID shutdowns and that whole thing. It seems like people are getting meaner. Yeah. And it's scary.
I didn't really talk that much before, but I mean, I keep so to myself right now that it's mind-boggling that, like, I don't want to even assert any kind of random statement that might cause someone to go ballistic.
I mean, I have a carry permit. Thank God I've never had to use it, but I always carry just in case something happens. Somebody's attacking me and it's a young person or something, I wouldn't have a second thought. Not have a second thought.
So those last two comments were from Jewish people that we talked to the week after October 7th. And, you know, I think about, this is just, I said this at the beginning, but it's worth restating here that part of what happens is that when we do focus groups in the aftermath of something horrific, and so, you know, in the weeks after October 7th, people would say, well, I'm Jewish and, you know, I feel deeply under threat now. I feel like anti-Semitism is ramping up. And so that has been thematically something that I would say I've seen really start to, and it has maintained. We hear a lot of that from Jews who are on the left and on the right, who talk a lot about the increased sense of violence around anti-Semitism. And, you know, back in 2020, after the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, there was also a real sense from Black voters that they were being targeted, that they felt like their lives were sort of under constant threat. And I think part of what's, I don't want to say interesting, but it's almost like for a lot of different types of people, there have been events over the last decade that have heightened their sense specifically related to who they are, right? I think trans people will tell you they feel specifically under threat. I hear from gay people who feel like after a sense that it's sort of America had come to terms with gay people, that it's, ramping back up, that sense that you're under threat if you're a gay person. Women talk about it all the time in terms of just their fear as women. And so this was in what Rachel was saying, but to me, one of the big takeaways is how much fear, right? This guy, he's talking about, because he's afraid, he carries a gun. It's the fear oftentimes then that also begets more violence. And fear can also really cloud sometimes your sense of proportion. And, so for example, just listening to folks on the right now talk about how like they're under siege, and there's a war. And in this moment where we still don't even know what the motivations were for the shooter, but to think about the idea that, right, what they're saying is, hey, they came for Charlie Kirk because Charlie Kirk was saying things that I say or that I think. And so that means they can come for me somebody would shoot me for holding these opinions. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important. You don't have to deny the way that you feel about the opinions that Charlie Kirk had. I do think it's very important to affirm the idea that nobody should be shot for having the opinions that Charlie Kirk had, because that fear is a driver toward more violence. Let's move on. These next bits of sound were from our flippers, who we talked to a lot. These were Trump 2016, Biden 2020 voters throughout 2024. Let's listen to them.
I'm a sensitive person, and I just noticed like there's an intensity on just the political climate, but just people in general coming out of the pandemic. And there's just this anger and this upset and rage really at, things that people can't control. And there's a lot of blaming and a lot of fear and a lot of feeling helpless.
It's just a scary time right now. Even my son is like, I'd rather just live in another country. Like, he just doesn't feel safe and raising his family here. And that's kind of scary that people are going to leave our country because they don't want to be here.
I never ever thought that I would see a day in my lifetime where I kind of wondered, are we going to have a civil war of some type in our country again, or, have to overthrow our government? And it does scare me.
I know most of my peers, people that we've talked to, my husband's a teacher as well. So many of our friends, people keep talking about civil war in America, and that's where they all think this is going.
So all but one of those quotes came right after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump last year. And it's when people were reacting to the Trump assassination, even with Trump, for some reason, there was maybe less sense of people saying yeah, you get what you deserve. Again, I think that people, especially people in positions of power and influence, were, quick to say things like this shouldn't happen, that political violence has no place. And Donald Trump referenced that shooting in what I thought was a really startling address last night, in which he, pointed the finger directly at the left in a, you did this, your rhetoric, you calling people Nazis. And that's the end of the sound that I have. But I guess there was something I wanted to say, and the reason I kind of scrapped our original plan. It's because it is very complicated in the face of political violence to kind of sort through. I have spent, I quit my job to go fight Donald Trump because I think he is a threat to America. And one of the things that I think he has done pretty consistently is use absolutely not just irresponsible, but often unhinged rhetoric about other Americans, whether it is making fun of disabled people or saying immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. I mean, for Donald Trump to be somebody who points the finger at other people over rhetoric is, it's almost too ridiculous to take seriously. But of course, many people will take it seriously. And I do think in situations like this, people want to blame someone. And there's a little bit of a catch-22. And this is the part I've been thinking about a lot, where on one hand, you do want to point out that Donald Trump uses extreme rhetoric all the time, that nobody has done more to inflame the negative passions of Americans than Donald Trump. And yet, you of course do not want him to be shot at. You don't want anyone to be shot at. And I know that some people on social media disagree because they'll say just the way that Don Jr. mocked Paul Pelosi is that people now have dehumanized their political opponents to such a degree that they're okay if something horrible befalls them. And I think the reason that it, like, the problem is that Donald Trump, he says, well, they call us Nazis. I tend to be pretty circumspect about the word Nazi, but I do think that Donald Trump has been moving us toward a much more authoritarian place. I do think he is dangerous. And I think he's dangerous because he nurtures violence in people. And one of the things I see from Democrats is just sort of a desperate attempt to fight back. And I know when I listen to Democratic voters talk about fighting back, what they mean is win elections, be more aggressive. Don't just sit back like a deer in headlights and let these guys steamroll you. And usually Democrats mean things like get rid of the filibuster, make DC a state. But there is this thing you can't ignore, and I don't think we should be bludgeoned into ignoring or not acknowledging how much Donald Trump and the people who follow him have, like, the lengths they've gone with their rhetoric to bring us to this place. And you don't have to like anything Charlie Kirk says or said. You can condemn it all. I just think about Nietzsche, where he said, be careful when you look into the abyss, that the abyss doesn't look back into you. Like, I don't want Donald Trump to chip away at all of our humanity. Like, we have to do the work of maintaining our humanity in the face of this. And that doesn't mean that we don't call it like we see it, that we don't tell the truth about how awful many of the things people said. Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, many people in, right-wing influencer circles. And I do think that there's a little bit of right now people, people are wrestling with what is kind of legitimate political discourse, right? We've sort of passed the point where we're arguing over what the marginal tax rate should be, right? When the stakes feel existential, and when the stakes in fact are very high, like, what does the future of the country look like? You want to take these things head on. But I think that every single one of us should be very clear about where the lines are. And the line stops at violence. It always stops at violence. Like, be mad. Go to the streets. Protest. Fight. Tell your story on social media. Flood the zone back. Call out their lies. Be clear. Be morally clear. Call out ideas that are bad. And frankly, I don't think that there's anything wrong with acknowledging how toxic some of the ideas are that you want to fight back. Like, you could say how toxic they are. But don't ever celebrate violence. Like, for all of us to be safe giving our opinions, for all of us to be safe doing our jobs, as polarized as we are, there's just always going to be somebody out there who hates you, hates your side, hates the things that you stand for. And the sum total of things like this happening are to make us feel more scared, less able to engage in political discourse, less able to fight for the things that we believe in, right? I want to be able to say the things that I believe to be true and fight for the things that I believe in and not be afraid of being shot. And I want that for the people who want to go to these protests. I want that for the people on the right who, are afraid that, I don't know, who are afraid of Palestinian protesters, for the Jewish kids who were aggressively pursued by some of the protesters on college campuses. Like, we've got to find lines that we live behind on this, even when the stakes feel existential, even when you feel and are sure that you are morally in the right. I want people to be able to fight hard for the things that they believe in. But we have to be able to condemn political violence and violence in general. Like what the thing that Rachel said, just violence begets more violence. It means more school shootings, more shootings in your grocery store. Like, we don't want to live like this. I don't want to live like this. So, I guess that's just a thing I wanted to say. I wanted to bring you some of the voices of people who are not experiencing all this by, banging out angry screeds online, just regular people from all sides of the political aisle who feel afraid and feel like they could be targeted, and who are worried about how damaged we all are and how much damage we're doing to each other. And I think that the best thing we can do is demand better of our political leaders and then set an example ourselves, even when it's hard, right? I may disagree with absolutely everything that someone says, but I'm going to still defend their right to say it, and certainly defend their right to be safe while saying it. And I do think that's where I hope other people will find themselves. So with that, I want to thank everyone for listening to an unconventional focus group podcast. At the end of the focus groups, whenever we're talking to the people who had just, sat with us for an hour or two, we always tell them to be well in the interesting times that we live in. And I hope that all of you do the same. Thanks, guys. We will be back next week.